Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Howard. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Virtru, and I am thrilled to be joined here today by two colleagues, Trevor Foskett, who runs our solutions engineering organization. Trevor, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey everyone. If you've been a fan of Hash It Out for a while, you've probably seen my face before, but if you haven't, Trevor Foskett, VP Solutions Engineering here at Virtru. I've been with the company for over 8 years now, and work with a lot of our large customers on their Virtru architectures, whether they're in the commercial or federal space. So excited to be here today and talk with the two of you guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Trevor. And grateful to have Adam Healy join us as well. Adam is the CEO of a company called Station 70 and the former CISO at BlockFi. Adam, welcome.
Glad to be here, Matt. I feel like this recording was probably several years in the making, probably by those following. But yeah, great to be here and talk to the two of you.
So that being said, I've been in this industry a long time. I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of folks, and a couple of months ago when you and I first had a chance to connect, it was enjoyable just to kind of see perspective from a person like yourself who has such an interesting background. Can you do me a favor and just sort of start by painting that backstory of yours, kind of like where you started, kind of where you went, and where you find yourself now, and just kind of give us a little bit of that backstory?
Sure. I'm glad you think it's interesting. I don't know that my wife would agree. She's probably heard it too many times. But yeah, so born and raised in Vegas, joined the Marine Corps. Spent some time in the government space. Was a contractor after I got out of the Marine Corps. Spent a number of years as a civil servant within the intelligence community, and then really wanted to get some more exposure outside of the government. So transitioned out of government service after a little over a decade, and joined Microsoft. Spent some time at Microsoft. Spent about 3 years at a company called Palantir. And from there, just kind of continued my journey within security. Always been very focused on cybersecurity and protecting things. The intersection, I think, for me, that where I started to get very interested in the industry was kind of the intersection between physical security and cybersecurity, and that having that seam there that can be often exploited by one bad actor that's focused on the other, or the other focused on on maybe more of a physical security threat, but using cyber to kind of target. So that became very interesting to me, and really have just been in love with the industry ever since. The last 7 years or so have been focused on the cryptocurrency space. So I was at a small startup that got acquired by Intercontinental Exchange. Intercontinental Exchange is the owner of the New York Stock Exchange and some other very large platforms in the world. And from there, we spun out a company called Bakkt that has subsequently gone public. And I was CISO. I was the first CISO at Bakkt as part of that spin out and that scale up. And that was a really interesting experience. And then following that, had spent about 3 years at a company called BlockFi. That company kind of still exists. It had gotten pulled into some of the FTX situation. For those that are familiar, highly recommend never having to be part of something like that. For those that lead organizations, it was very difficult to go through. But as that dust settled, started Station 70, and still in the cryptocurrency ecosystem, although Station 70 is more of an infrastructure provider at this point, and we're primarily focused on something we call trusted recovery, which for those that know a little bit about the crypto ecosystem, there's this concept of self custody, being able to control your own private keys, both for institutions and individuals. And we primarily focus at Station 70 on the institutional side, although we will have a retail product coming sometime next year. But our focus really is on the institutional side today, helping organizations that could be hedge funds, family offices, registered investment advisors, banks, doesn't really matter to us, that are custodying some of their assets, meaning they have access to their private keys. They're not stored in third-party custody, say Coinbase custody or something like that, and having a disaster recovery and business continuity suite of services that they can leverage in the event something happens to their wallet providers.
That's super cool. I know we met in your journey through BlockFi when you were a customer of Virtue's, and congrats on starting Station 70. It certainly is a fascinating space, and it's one that I think is super relevant given the work that we do at Virtue. Trevor, I'm curious, given what Adam just shared with respect to Station 70, this idea of like self-custody over keys, or bring your own key, or privacy enhanced cloud collaboration, however you want to think about it. Can you just share some thoughts with respect to kind of Virtue's view on that concept, and maybe what we're doing with Virtue Private Key Store?
Yeah, it's funny. This takes us back to the topic that we had discussed in the very first one of these Hash It Out sessions, which was really a discussion around security in the cloud. And one of the points that we teased out there was that when you think about SaaS or cloud, at the end of the day, it's someone else's server or someone else's there is no cloud, right? And so when we use a lot of these cloud services, you're just putting information up in that cloud. And so again, this idea of custody, agency, owning your own data or owning your own keys comes back into play, because as we think about at Virtue, people's unstructured data, email files, they're often putting them into a Microsoft cloud or a Google cloud. And how do you maintain control when it's ultimately sitting in someone else's infrastructure? So similar to what Adam discussed with, is my private key sitting with Coinbase, or do I have it myself? We see that same desire for agency and ownership amongst businesses looking to control their data of, as I have this data sitting in someone else's cloud, how do I control it? Can I possess my own encryption keys for that data to ensure that I am the one in control of that data? So it's an interesting kind of parallel here, talking about whether it's data assets or monetary assets, kind of a similar approach to, I need to protect it, and I want to be the one to protect it rather than you just telling me you're protecting it.
Well, and in some cases, data is as valuable as the monetary aspect, right? So depending upon the data we're talking about, intellectual property, trade secrets, etc.
Sure, yeah, just a layer of abstraction, moving it away from a currency, but it's still valuable, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, in our sort of journey at Virtue, I think Google deserves definitely some credit. We've been so focused for a long time on this idea of granular policy controls on sensitive unstructured data that's inevitably coming in and out of the business, and wanting to kind of govern that with better security, better privacy. Google's advanced the ball with respect to this concept of client-side encryption, and saying to companies, hey, if you want to do business, run your business on the Google Workspace Cloud with things like doc sheets, slides, really sensitive information, you can. And not only can you, but you can be the one to keep the key yourself, so that it's ciphertext to us. I mean, because it's your data, it's your private sensitive data. And that idea of privacy enhanced cloud collaboration, I think Google's a real lead in. So it's emergent. I mean, it's the first inning of that game, and we're certainly playing in it ourselves. But I imagine, I'm curious, Adam, where does the typical high net worth individual with, I don't know, $100 million worth of crypto assets sit in terms of like the baseball game, or a family office with lots of crypto assets? I mean, are they sort of looking at it and sort of saying, we know we need to get a grip on this, and therefore we want to find someone like Station 70 to manage these keys, because that's super sensitive to us and it's super complicated. We don't want to, run the risk of messing it up. I mean, what's the state of the market with respect to those customers that you're targeting with Station 70?
Yeah, so our customers range wildly, right? Very, very well-established brand name financial institutions to family offices with, I would say most family offices, if they have 100 million in Bitcoin, as you mentioned, are well ahead of the curve than compared to their peers, which is probably good for them this week. But I think that there's a lot of concern around messing it up, right? There's also a lot of concern around having a legal structure in place such that beneficiaries can take control of trusts and other assets that or other legal structures that are protecting assets. Having additional parties in control. So maybe a family office is worried about some type of phishing or social engineering attack. So they want their lawyer or their accountant to be part of a funds movement, somebody kind of outside of the bubble, if you will. So there's a lot of concerns. Physical security is a big concern also. So having a system in place, basically like duress infrastructure, duress protocols in the event that somebody is being is under duress. I actually worked a case a couple of years ago now, where we actually did get FBI involved. There was somebody being held against their will overseas that was traveling, and somebody was trying to abscond with their crypto assets. So these are very real problems, and I think most individuals, most families, most high net worth individuals that are holding material amounts of crypto, they are really looking for an easy button, right? They, in most cases, they want something that is turnkey, very secure, very easy to use, audited, vetted, tested, and something that they can just turnkey and use, and they don't have to worry about it. One of, who I won't name, but one of the wallets that we work with, when you onboard with them, they send you a PDF of 37 pages of how to back up your keys. Go get 2 air-gapped laptops, go get 6 USB keys, follow these steps, run this Python script, and like, that's just not tenable, right? For even large banks, like that's not tenable, to be entirely honest, in many cases. So we kind of just we provide this kind of turnkey disaster recovery key backup solution that's zero knowledge to us. So we use different cryptographic schemes that allow us to never actually know the underlying keys. To us, similar to kind of what you described, Matt and Trevor, it's ciphertext to us. And in many ways, we're just a ciphertext management company at the end of the day that uses a bunch of fancy cryptography and confidential compute.
Yeah, super interesting. Trevor, curious to get your thoughts on that and the parallels.
Yeah, I mean that is really, lots of terms that we use for it ourselves, whether that's, you want to call it split knowledge or zero trust, but this idea that I think we're starting to see the market finally kind of shift away from. The older security model used to be based around this idea of, well, I've looked into this provider, I trust them, so they can have my sensitive data. And for a lot of us, that was, I'll put my keys into this retail platform, such as a Coinbase or something. Or it could be, well, I've gone through a security assessment with this application I'm using, and I trust that I can put my data into it. Really now moving into this model of, well, even that's giving up a little bit more than I'd like. The idea that I need to trust some third party with my sensitive data in the name of security is a little bit antithetical to what we're trying to accomplish. And so that zero trust model of how can I leverage the tools that you provide without actually giving you the underlying data structure is, again, very similar to what we're doing ourselves, whether it's you hold your own keys and we only hold a ciphertext, or breaking keys up into multiple parts to achieve that split knowledge. All these things geared toward that idea of I shouldn't ever have to give you the underlying asset, whatever it may be, data, cryptographic key material, etc. All ties into the way that it seems like there is a little bit of momentum behind this trend now.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of, and there's actually some numbers that we could put to it in maybe a slightly different setting, but we're seeing a trend, especially at least in our world, right, in the crypto ecosystem. I mentioned FTX earlier. Obviously, that story is still being told, but when that happened, that was a custodial relationship, right? So you give them your assets, they manage the keys on the blockchain for you. You have an API token or maybe a username, password, 2FA, hopefully, set up. And but at the end of the day, they could do what they want on chain with your assets. Right. And there's been a huge recoil across the industry, institutions down to the individual, down to the main street, Joe down the street investor, to get out of a custodial relationship with their exchange or their trading venue and move to something that is what we would call in the industry self-custody, and not using one of these custodians. And we've seen funds flow, tens of billions of dollars worth, flow to more of this self-custody model in a post-FTX world.
So it's clearly not my domain. I know barely enough to be dangerous, but I continue to see sort of a theme here, which is people, whether they're individuals sort of holding lots of crypto assets, or whether they're companies having lots of intellectual property stored in emails, whether it's data or a financial instrument, the idea is that we want to basically take advantage of something like Google Cloud and the fact that Google, Microsoft Office 365, they have servers and infrastructure and capital invested in applications that allow me to run my business with tools like Outlook and Gmail and sheets and, Excel. And I want all of that as a business or an individual, but I want to actually retain my data. I want to have agency over my data, just like I want to have agency over my keys in a financial sense, or as you call it, custody, self-custody. When we were speaking a while ago, this concept of agency is really interesting to me. Just recently, I went back and reread sort of, for many folks in the industry, they might be familiar with Eric Hughes and the Cypherpunk Manifesto, which was written all the way back in 1992, I believe, a long, long time ago. And, in that moment in time, he was talking about this idea of agency. You said to me something really interesting. You said agency is hard. People understand the concept, but it's hard. Curious to kind of have you pick that apart, Adam.
Sure. So if we think about this, and we balance on one end of the spectrum, fully outsourcing everything, whether it's your data or your financial assets, whatever, to a third party, and maybe you've done some diligence on them. We maybe we should, or we could at some point discuss how diligence is an area within the enterprise space that could use a lot of work, and why it's now become more of a checkbox than a security control. But that being said, right, there's that fully, I trust this third party. I've looked at them, I've vetted them, I've checked the box, and they're good. And then there's the other, which is you have that control of that data, that asset, whatever that may be. But it's hard, right? In the crypto context, the tooling just simply isn't there to do it efficiently. You have to have a fairly technical background to do it safely and efficiently, and making sure that you're counting all of your taxes correctly, making sure that you're not exposing yourself or your family to undue physical risk. There's a professional athlete that I've spent a good bit of time with and holds a material amount of crypto. And one of his chief concerns is when he is on the road traveling, it's kind of known that he holds crypto based on some of the investments he's made. Is there going to be somebody that thinks all of that crypto is in a safe at home with his wife and his kids? So, that's a very real concern for some individuals. So when you take all of that together, having agency, whether it's your data, right? I can just throw the data into Google Cloud or to S3 or to wherever, and it should be good, right? Or do I actually want to have control over it and implement tools like Virtru and others, and being able to have control of it? But then that assumes that, one, I have the technical acumen and the bandwidth as an organization to do that. And that the tooling is good enough to do that. And I think this kind of comes back to something I said again previously. It's like the easy button, right? If you have the tools and the UX is there, and it's simple to integrate, and it all makes sense, you'll get more user adoption. Just clearly that's the case. So, but it's still going to be hard. You're still taking responsibility for some aspect of your data or your assets or your money or whatever that may be.
Yeah, and
you make a.
Sorry, Trevor. I just wanted to sort of ask you a very specific question, Trevor. He mentioned the easy button, and these conversations are never intended to be about Virtru, but I do think it's an interesting point he makes with respect to the easy button. We thought a lot about that in the course of our own journey in this industry. I'm curious to get your take on that, whether that's the easy button for something as simple as like encrypting an email with our Chrome plugin, or potentially something like our key store to kind of give somebody a fully managed way to manage, keys. I mean, how important is ease of use, ease of implementation in your view?
Well, I think it's wildly important. I mean, Adam just said that some of these processes that exist today are out of scope for some of the more, technically sophisticated organizations out there, right? And so if that's what you're dealing with, clearly we have an issue. There has to be a better way. And so a lot of this is, what we find when we talk to security professionals who are managing data for organizations like this, is they're trying to find that balance, right? At the one hand, they have an obligation to protect this information or these assets, whatever it may be, but they also have an obligation to their workforce or to the usability of those funds or whatever it is. You can put it on a USB and throw it in the trash. Then those funds are never accessible, but you got to be able to get them back if you actually want to have any value in holding them. So trying to understand what is our own risk posture here and looking at this holistically. What does the ecosystem look like? What is our risk tolerance, and where can we strike that balance between what's going to make sense for us as an organization versus what makes sense for our security posture, and how do we meet those two in the middle? Yeah, Adam, when we were discussing this earlier, you said that some organizations go as far as to say, we're not going to do anything because it has to be usable. So we're just sort of going to not address the security concern because we're so far on the ease of use side of the spectrum. Others have found themselves in places where they have user populations rebelling against the administration because of the tools they put in place, making it so hard to do their jobs. And so finding that balance, I think, is one that, for certain workflows, we've done a great job at it at Virtru of how can we make, easily approachable, unstructured data protectable. Let's bring in tools that leverage those cloud services that we love, that have those economies of scale built in, and the sort of minimum viable requirement, to protect that data but make it usable to the user is a tough spot to find yourselves in. But it sounds like, Adam, you guys have sort of honed in on where that balance sits for the crypto space as well, in terms of how do you leverage a lot of these popular wallet softwares that are out there, but also have some of that control yourself rather than going full managed or full cloud?
Yeah, I mean, for us, like, a lot of it is core. The term I use often, especially when talking with maybe mid-sized hedge funds, they've got a few hundred million or maybe up to $1 billion in assets under management, things like that. Is, well, what's your core competency? Your core competency is making money for your investors, right? It is generating a return, it's trading, it's analysis, it's research, etc. Your core competency probably is not, moderately advanced cryptography and making sure it works in a globally distributed way in a high assurance, multi-zone, multi-region, multi-jurisdictional context. And they're like, yeah, that's not really our business. Cool. Well, those are areas where it makes sense to have a trusted partner that can, one, do it for you, but maybe more importantly, do it for you safely. And there are absolutely organizations who, and it's always shocking to me today, even today with all the headlines, that almost feel like it's not going to happen to us, or we're not worried about that. And it's one of those situations where you can lead a horse to water kind of thing, right? So you hone in on the customers or the prospective customers that actually know that there's a problem, and then they want to address it. And you help them along that journey. I think the big trick, and having built several security programs at this point, BlockFi being a fairly sophisticated security operation, is you have to strike that balance. Something I said a lot at BlockFi was, there's no such thing as risk zero. It's we're going to try to get there, but we'll never get there. So it's risk management, and how do we enable the organization, the trading desk, the lending desk, the retail services folks, like, how do we enable that while managing the risk in the best way possible for the organization? And you do occasionally have to make hard trade-offs. And I think in some organizations, they're very hard trade-offs, especially when you see things like Joe Sullivan, or what happened recently with the CISO, the former CISO from SolarWinds. Like, those are very jarring for the CISO community, and it really makes you kind of step back and wonder. The first question that most CISOs should ask before they take the job is, are they covered under the DNO policy? But assuming that's a yes, it really does make you step back and think, well, the defense can't simply be, if it comes to that, I built the roadmap and the CFO didn't fund it. So how are you mobilizing across the organization to get traction to solve a lot of these security challenges? And a big one that we've kind of honed in on is this kind of third-party risk idea. If you fully outsource everything to a third party and you have no agency over what's there, then you've opened yourself up to a fairly large risk. It may not be the risk of you doing that service, but it's the risk of that third party, whether it's HubSpot or Okta or Cloudflare or any of the major breaches that we've seen recently. These are real issues, even for what I would consider those three companies, kind of top tier companies. They invest quite heavily in cybersecurity, but they're still victims.
Yeah, there's so much to pick apart there. You mentioned an area of cybersecurity, or cyber governance might be a better term, that needs to be rethought, is this idea of diligence. I mean, I think it's easy to look at an Okta, or pick your favorite, publicly traded multi-billion-dollar cloud provider, and think of them, check the box on diligence. They must be good at what they're doing.
Everyone uses them.
Everyone uses them. I mean, nobody ever got fired for buying from IBM. That was the story.
The funny thing is one of the things that we heard prior to FTX collapsing was, well, everyone trades on FTX. How bad?
Yeah.
Like what do you like? Of course they're safe.
Yeah, and nobody in the federal government, doesn't do business with Microsoft, and yet the State Department this past summer, found themselves in a really difficult situation as a result of Microsoft making a pretty basic mistake. I mean, it's just like, I don't know. I don't want to get too depressed. I do want to maybe kind of recognize that this is hard stuff. And to your point about Joe Sullivan and the CISO at SolarWinds or at was the SolarWinds victim. Anyhow, you know what I'm talking about. What was the name of the company that got breached by SolarWinds?
Blanking.
There were several companies, but the SolarWinds CISO recently found himself in legal troubles. The former CISO at SolarWinds, yeah.
Right.
Well, where I was going with that is the CISO job is brutal, as you know, and the new reality with respect to the regulatory realm and CISOs finding themselves potentially subject to legal action has just put a whole new light on this. And as hard it is to do the job well, the job needs to be done. And architecturally, I'm just kind of curious to get your thoughts on this idea that for 20 years, arguably, we as an industry, writ large, big industry, have been spending tons of money, tons of time, tons of energy, tons of effort trying to organize and govern and structure, you could argue, perimeter-centric controls to protect sensitive data from a number of bad actors who are intent on stealing it. That's the identity world with Okta and Ping. That's the endpoint world with CrowdStrike and Palo Alto. That's the network world with Zscaler and whoever. It's even the application security guys. And then we are here today, and we're having this conversation where for all of that investment, for all of that effort, we continue to see challenges, breaches, and compromise. And is there a time coming? I'm curious. Is there a time coming where architecturally there's a shift in mindset where it sort of goes from protecting data by proxy and moving policy and governance and control to a more granular level where you're actually doing it at the object level? Is that plausible, or is that just so hard that it'll never happen?
I think it's plausible. But I think it is very difficult because I even think about my time within the intelligence community. We were chasing a number of different very interesting initiatives to get incredibly granular with data control. And, this was peak of global war on terror. So some would argue that our budgets were effectively unlimited. And we had every resource kind of at our disposal, especially in a post-Snowden world, to do things. And to protect data, and it was incredibly challenging. Right there's something I coined during that era of my career was the fallacy of uniqueness. Agency 1 and agency 2 really have the exact same problem, but when they show up to the working group, it's let me tell you about my unique problems on why your solution won't work for me. So there is a good bit of that, but I think zooming out, it is a really hard problem. These are, for as long as we've had these problems, these organizations have been building, especially the larger, more sophisticated organizations, have been building massive infrastructures. Like there are some systems. There's up until 2015, there was a large, national retailer that was still running Windows 2000. This is in 2015, Windows 2000 to run their fax machines. And it was too hard to rip out. So the stuff gets very difficult, and it becomes a priority. And I do often, a lot of times, there is an architectural shift. And, we talked a little about this before. The concern with the architectural shift is, as an industry, especially the larger, more sophisticated, therefore the more interesting targets, potentially the threat actors, it takes so long to pivot to what we would consider the best security practices of the day. Mm-hmm. The threat actors pivot in record time, right? Like it was weeks until probably even, I saw weeks, I'm sure others saw hours or days before things like ChatGPT were weaponized by threat actors. It didn't take long. And meanwhile, you have companies trying to discuss their AI security strategy that are still using SMS2FA. Like there's priorities here, folks. There's an order of events that we have to work on things. So it's there is a lot of work to be done. And if I knew what the right solution, the right recipe was, I would write a book about it and sell a lot of copies. But I don't, because every organization, as much as I joke about the fallacy of uniqueness, every organization is a little unique, right? There are unique politics, unique bureaucracies, unique policies, unique regulators. It becomes fairly complex to shift, to turn any of these aircraft carriers. But I do think a move away from the perimeter security, we still need that, right? There's still a place for that, but getting towards something that is more focused on the object, right? Whether it's a private key or a file or a whatever, getting more focused on the object is inevitably where we have to go. We have to move to a model where we assume breach. Some of these organizations are so large and sprawling. I'd wager that there's probably very few that don't have some type of ongoing breach they're just not aware of yet, right? So if we shift into that model, and go with more of like a red team focused approach, I think we end up in a much better position. And at the same time, I draw a lot of flack because I joke about this Windows 2000 fax system. Like, I'm the first one to say, when the patch management, vulnerability management team comes running to me with this list of patches that need to get done, and they're shocked. I'm like, well, let's prioritize these, right? Is this on a system that is behind 6 firewalls, not connected to the internet, and you need a YubiKey to get to? We don't have to disrupt the business to patch that. And I think that's also a lens, is kind of that pragmatism and making sure that as security professionals, we're not framing everything as the sky is falling. And then we get more traction to make those changes.
Yeah. It's a 80-20, 90-10, but in a world where everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So something has to be the priority, and you have to chip away at it. There's a lot of debt back there for sure. This has been a lot of fun. I want to maybe just kind of close with this thought. You mentioned it well. I again grateful for the time, but for the same reason that a mid-market hedge fund will partner with you and Station 70 to kind of leverage your competencies with respect to managing keys associated with crypto assets. It's about doing what's right with respect to protecting sensitive data, or in that case, assets, with tools, services, and expertise that scale. And, in the same view of, unstructured data that sort of lives and breathes in a cloud collaboration platform called Google Workspace or Office 365, a middle market healthcare company will partner with Trevor and the team at Virtru to implement Virtru Private Key Store, so that they ultimately possess control over their destiny with respect to their data, because it is their data. And at the end of the day, it's about self-agency and having the opportunity to take advantage of all of the wonderful things that the public cloud infrastructure offers all of us, but at the same time having the ability to kind of have granular controls over the data, and being able to selectively reveal the information that we choose to share with public cloud providers is, very much the ethos of the Cyberpunk Manifesto written by Eric Hughes, which I think is super cool way to tie this all back. Trevor, any closing thoughts from you?
No, I mean, I think you both made points in your last little pieces there that do kind of tie this all together. Matt, you mentioned from the Cyberpunk Manifesto, that line that we have at Virtru have all seen so many times before at every one of our all hands meetings, that ability to selectively reveal. And Adam, you mentioned, the perimeter is still important, as is the data object. I think all of this goes back into making the right tools available so that you do have that ability to be selective and stand up the controls that make the most sense for your needs, your preferences, your risk posture, whatever it may be. You don't have to do everything.
Your uniqueness.
There you go. You don't have to do everything this way, but there are options out there for you so that you're not pigeonholed into one of these mechanisms of, well, the only option is to put everything in the cloud and hope that it's okay. Right. We want to make that if you don't feel okay with that, then you have options like a Station 70, like a Virtru, to pull some of that back and be, as we say, selective about what you're revealing to the world.
100%. Yep. Trevor, thanks very much. Adam, thank you very much. Kudos and congrats on Station 70. Super cool company. And we very much appreciate your time today.